How can you sense when Santa's close? You can feel his presence. What's going on, YouTube? So yesterday on stream, we made ourselves a Mythic tier list. Now, I respect your time, so we're not going to do the whole, ooh, let's put all the Mythics on one by one. What we're going to do in this video is we're going to show the tier list, and then we're going to go S tier, A tier, B tier, and all the way down through the rest of them, and then highlight each Mythic in that tier, starting with the best ones. That way, if you're short on time, you get to see, hey, these are the good Mythics. Let's focus on those, and then if you want to see the ones that are arguably not worth your time, then you can stick around, have some fun, and then hear about why some mythics are just not very good. And if you've not seen our tier list yet, because you weren't on that live stream, here is that tier list. Now, to quickly break down what exactly is an S tier, an A tier, B tier, a D tier, and below a 5.9. Well, to me, a S tier is a staple. That is, you build a specific build around that set. It is something that you use as a basis point to use. It's pretty much an auto include for different types of content. Not to say that you can't use other things, but if you had it, it's definitely the option to go with. A tier are things that are excellent and fantastic. If you find yourself using the word to describe these mythics as excellent or fantastic, that is where we put our A tier. B tier is where things are great. You know, not excellent, not fantastic, but yeah, it's a great build. So if you said to me, Jake, I'm using these sets here, I'd be like, yeah, that's a great build. Then below that, we have good. Now, good starts to get to the point where you're like, yeah, that's a good build, I guess. You know, not great, not excellent or fantastic. You're not running the staple of those sets. So we're starting to get a little bit off the way here. And then D tier is it's above average. So it's better than, you know, wearing a random set in the game. And to be fair, like, there's a lot of bad sets in the game these days, so you're probably not going to be finding things that are too far below average, or, you know, too far above the below average point. So thankfully, most mythics are not that bad. And then below 5.9, we did not have any, but as we break these down one by one, I will also mention where chat kind of disagreed with themselves, because this was all done by Twitch and YouTube chat. I actually didn't do any of this, so if you look at this and you're like, Jake, why is this there? It's actually not my fault. You have to go rewatch the VOD and then blame everybody collectively that was there. Joking aside, this was obviously very contentious just because lots of opinions involved, but we were able to mostly agree, and if we didn't, we just put it to a poll, and then we were able to vote. Should this be a 9 or an 8? Also, this does not take into consideration how popular a type of content is. So, for example, the first mythic is the Ring of the Wild Hunt. I love the Ring of the Wild Hunt. It increases your movement speed by 15% while in combat. It increases your movement speed by 45% while out of combat. You could stack this with Major, Minor, Expedition. You can get so much movement speed with this, but you're like, Jake, I'm not going to really wear this, you know, in most types of content. And that's true, but if you wanted to make the best in slot farming build, you go out, you pick up Nurn Cruxes, you loot things, maybe you just want to do overland solo content with a bit of movement speed, this is the staple mythic to go with. Now, obviously, people will use this in PvP from time to time because speed is great. Even 15% while in combat and then 45% while out of combat is just absolutely fantastic. But that, you know, regrade these on their best utilizations, and the best utilization for this is generally gold farming, thieving, questing, you know, and that may sound silly, but I want to point out something to people because there's a lot of people who think that you have to use a specific set for best in slot, PvP or PvE. I want to point out something to you. When scribing was released, there was, let's say, there's 5 hours of content that you had to do to get it all done. I was able to do that in half the time because I was able to use movement speed stuff. I was able to use stage 4 vampirism, and essentially I saved myself 2.5 hours. And so it's no disrespect if you're trying to get a lot of these questings and things done that you need to do to optimize your characters in the best way possible. So Ring of the Wild Hunt, easy S tier, and it's also a good staple for crafting. It's for going out, getting all the materials that you may need, gold farming, even solo overland content. Even PvP content, it's pretty good. Moving right along in the S tier, we have Death Dealer's Feet. Now, this ring I absolutely love, and This is a bit of a product of the S tier because right now it is very meta. But I do want to note that it probably will not remain at a 10.0 staple just because likely the classes that are using it right now will be nerfed. But the classes that are using it right now, this is a PvP mythic. They are feasting. Sorcerers, love it. Wardens, love it. And those are two classes with max mag builds and max health and stand builds. They are feasting for their mag versions of themselves, and they're able to just push out tons of health and stamina to go along with it. So, what this does is basically every 2 seconds you're in combat, up to 30 stacks, you gain additional 88 magicka, health, stamina. So, it's just a fantastic way to get a bunch of resources. Generally, Magicka builds want to use this because, for example, as a sorcerer, I don't really use a lot of stamina, but I need to roll dodge, block, sprint. So having that extra is just very helpful. Mag Wardens, also a huge popular user of these, but there are other ways you can obviously build sorcerers, Mag Wardens. But right now, if you've gone into Grey Host or Battlegrounds, you're going to be noticing this is a pretty popular mythic to run. That's why you got to put it in the S tier. But I will note, future-proofing it, it usually is probably closer to an A tier. But right now, it's in the S tier. Next up is Mora's Whisper. So we're back to the weird mythics. But what this one does is it gives you 1528 crit chance and an increased 10% inspiration, alliance rank, and alliance skill gain, and an additional 15% monster kill experience based on how many of Shalador's books you have collected. Now, this is a very odd mythic because it, on one hand, does something completely unique, but on another hand, it requires you to have Shalador's books, which are those Mage's Guild books if you're not familiar, and that can be a pretty pain in the ass to get. And this mythic, also, spoiler, bit of a pain in the ass to get. So, obviously, it's a staple for XP farming because it gives you a brand new experience of 15% experience based on how many books you have, so you kind of have to put it in the S tier. But do you need it? It's a bit difficult to say because obviously, on one hand, you're going to be in a situation where likely if you have a bunch of Shalador's books already where you're going to get that 15% buff, you're probably already high champion point leveled. So you're probably thinking to yourself, well, why do I need a mythic that's just going to give me more XP? Because after 1200 CP, there's really no returns on increasing your stats by increasing your champion points level. So it may or may not be essential, but if you're like around 160 CP and you really want to farm and have a mythic and you have a specific character that you have a lot of Shalador's books picked up already, I think this is a great mythic to get. Next up is the Harpooner's Wading Kilt, which is very straightforward. Dealing direct damage grants you a stack of Hunter's Focus for 20 seconds, up to a maximum 10 stacks. You can only gain 1 stack of Hunter's Focus per second, and each stack of Hunter's Focus increases your crit chance by 110 and your crit damage by 1%. But taking damage removes 5 stacks. So you can have 10 in total, you take damage, you lose 5 of them. And if for some reason you remove the kilt, you would lose all of your stacks. So this is a bit of a unique set because this is the mythic that you can use to basically deal some of the best damage in the game pretty consistently for trials. But a lot of 4-man content, solo content, overland content, PvP, you're going to be taking damage, so you're not going to be able to use this. So this is a staple set for a lot of trial DPSers. And when this mythic came out, everybody and their mom was farming it. It was very competitive to get the leads. It still is a staple, but people kind of mention it like, you really need this mythic. And it's like, well, it's good, but if you're just farming dungeons with the boys, there's a decent chance that this mythic is not going to be super great because you're going to be taking damage and you're not going to be able to get its full effect, and you probably would do better off with a different monster set combo. But that being said, it's still an S tier set. You're probably just going to see it more trial focused, but that doesn't mean it's not good for 4-man content. But if you were getting something more consistent, like a monster set of like Zons, you're probably going to do better for 4-man content. Next up is the Oaken Soul Ring. I mean, everybody in the chat had varying degrees of thoughts and opinions about the Oaken Soul Ring. What it does if you somehow live under a rock. While equipped, you can't bar swap. And then you gain Minor Berserk, Minor Courage, Major Brutality, Major Sorcery, Major Prophecy, Major Savagery, Minor Force, Minor Protection, Major Resolve, Minor Mending, Minor Fortitude, Minor Intellect, Minor Endurance, Minor Heroism, Minor Slayer, Minor Aegis, and Empower. It obviously is a divisive mythic, and you might think to yourself, Jake, how is this divisive? You just can't bar swap, you just get a bunch of bonuses for losing all 6 of the skills that you would have on your back bar. Well, that's kind of where the division begins, is a lot of people think, rightly or wrongly, that it is kind of lowering the skill bar and it's kind of teaching people to play the game without their essentially 6 more skills. And there are some types of content that you really require you to be able to use both skill bars. There are trials, for example, where you have to bar swap. Now, that's very specific and niche, and a lot of people love the Mythic. And I just want to point out that my audience loves this Mythic, so I'm not going to trash it. I do think that you should practice bar swapping, even if you do use 1-bar builds for different types of content. If you want to throw together an easy 1-bar build to farm arenas and stuff, and maybe some 4-man content, I think that's great. For PvP, I definitely think that you should practice with both bars, because 6 skills is a lot. And that's a lot of, tools that you're losing for yourself. That's where I don't want to say I have a problem with it, but I think you're limiting yourself, because now you basically have to live with the skills you have on 1 bar. It's a fantastic Mythic. It's an easy S tier. But that's a bit of the shrouded controversy about it. Next up, we have the Sea Serpent's Chain. Now, I actually predicted that people would put this closer in A tier. Let's talk about why that is. So, while at full health, you gain 40% damage reduction after taking damage. While at full health in combat, you gain Serpent's Rebuke for 10 seconds, snaring yourself by 40%, and you gain Major Berserk and Major Courage. Now, that increases your damage done and your weapon and spell damage by 430. The damage resistance does not apply while Serpent's Rebuke is active. So, this is very straightforward. You take damage, get snared, deal a bunch of damage. People love this for PvP. And also, when you're first hit, you take significantly less damage. It was a staple, I would say, for a long time in PvP. But, spoiler, there's a new staple for PvP builds that I thought people might be a little bit more like, this is closer to an A tier, but everybody on the live stream pretty much universally said Sea Serpent still deserves to be in the S tier, because it is still a staple for PvP. If you're looking to build a PvP build, Sea Serpent's Coil is absolutely fantastic to do so, and thankfully, not a terrible Mythic to go and get for yourself. Next up, we have one of our first new Mythics, and it's a bit of a weird one. We have Workin's Steam Guards. While bracing, you gain Steam Guardian for half a second, reducing your damage taken by 90%. This effect activates only upon the start of bracing and can occur once every 10 seconds. Blocking any attack while Steam Guardian is active reduces its cooldown by 5 seconds, up to once per application. So, in chat, basically the conversation went like this. This is a highly skilled Mythic, but if you can get it to work, essentially you're getting 90% damage reduction every 5 seconds. That's pretty good. But it is very finicky, because your time windows are very narrow. Now, this is just one of those Mythics that if you can get good with it, that's absolutely fantastic. But what I would say is that you probably don't need to get good with this Mythic. It's one of those style ones where it's not going to come into your daily content life. For example, if I'm saying, everybody, go farm Maelstrom Arena, go farm Infinite Archive, blah, 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 I'm not going to be like, hey, everybody, put on the Steam Guards, or go to the Imperial City and slap on the Steam Guards. That's what I mean, that, most players are probably not going to use it. It's much more focused on tanking type of content, definitely some PvP utilization as well, as you can imagine. But thankfully, you shouldn't have to really focus on getting good with this Mythic. But if you do, it's a staple Mythic. It is the creme de la creme of reducing your damage taken. Next up, we have Torque of the Ayleid King, which 90% of the comments are now going to be filled with people going, Jake, I have the Torque of the Ayleid King. It was so easy. I just did Infinite Archive. 1 round, I got all 5 leads. Yeah, whatever. Torque of the Ayleid King notoriously comes from the Infinite Archive chest, which they can sense when you want it, and therefore you don't get it. So everybody in the comments was able to trick the algorithm into thinking that they did not want the leads to drop. But why is Torque of the Ayleid King an S tier Mythic? Because I actually thought this was closer to an A tier Mythic. So this is what chat said. They said that essentially Torque of the Ayleid King is a staple for, you want to try a new character out for PvP? Just throw it on. What it does is it reduces your damage taken by 15%, adds 1337 weapon and spell damage, 500 magicka and stamina recovery, but you just don't get any other set bonuses. So all those 5-piece sets, those monster sets, they don't do shit. The only thing that they do is they give you the bonuses for the traits that are on them, and they give you the bonuses for having light, medium, or heavy as the flavor of what you're wearing. And if you're using a fire staff, then you still get to have it as a fire staff. So it's very unique in what it does. And I think that I agree with the chat that it is kind of a staple of you just leveled up an Arcanist all the way. You level up a Sorcerer, throw this on there. Don't worry about the gear that you got to get for yourself and just test it out. Next up was an easy one to get everybody to agree on. That is the Saint and Seducer Mythic. Now, the Saint and Seducer Mythic is the creme de la creme Mythic right now for PvP, and it's also super easy to get. While in combat, you gain one of 5 major random buffs, which change every 10 seconds. Enemies within 12 meters of you gain one of 5 random minor debuffs, depending on the buff that you have. So, for example, the available effects are Major Berserk and Minor Maim. That means that while you have Major Berserk, everybody within 12 meters of you has Minor Maim. And so on for the rest of these. Major Resolve, Minor Breach, Major Force, Minor Brittle, Major Evasion, Minor Vulnerability, Major Courage, Minor Cowardice. So this right now is the creme de la creme of PvP, because being able to essentially throw debuffs around every 10 seconds and give yourself one of some amazing buffs every 10 seconds is just really good. And the way that you get this lead is very easy. Now, all you have to do, we'll talk about the hard one last, but Orderon Dolmens, piece of cake. World bosses in Alarkir, easy. The Delve boss, all public dungeon bosses in the Vile Maids, super easy. Maelstrom Arena, first chest, likely all stages. That's the hardest one, and you can just slap that on a normal difficulty run and just refarm the first chest if you're, not somebody who enjoys PvE content, and you could get this mythic pretty quickly. Next, we have this mythic, which is one of the most flavorful mythics they've had in the game. That's Shadow Queen's Cowl. While crouched, you see witnesses and guards through walls. Successfully pickpocketing a witness or guard applies distracted to them for 10 seconds, stunning them and decreasing their stealth detection radius by 30 meters for that duration. So obviously, there's no other real mythics like this. In fact, the only other mythic that you may consider if you're trying to thieve and do all sorts of stuff is Ring of the Wild Hunt, which, to be fair, great option as well. But it doesn't do the same thing. You can see people through walls, you can distract them, it making it easier to re-pickpocket, Blade of Woe, do all sorts of, shenanigans when it comes to your stealing content. So I just think that this is a really good one. And the nice thing too is this is also a really easy mythic to get. Public dungeons, world events, world bosses. Really, it's only Moongrave Fane bosses, but thankfully it's not the final boss that it comes from. It's all the bosses there, and then it's finally just another Delve boss. So pretty easy mythic to get, and I could recommend it if you want to make a little thieving build. This is not the cowl that you get in Oblivion, though, Shadowly. That is the Grey Fox mask. They are technically different. Next up, we have the Pearls mythic, which a lot of you are probably saying, Jake, say the second word there. Pearls of what? I'm not saying it. You can go listen to me say it on stream. Everybody was like, you're not saying it correctly. I don't know what you want from me. These are made up words, all right? I can't even pronounce normal words correctly. When you attempt to use a resource to cast a healing ability while in combat and your dominant resource is under 50%, gain 3 ultimate. It's very straightforward. It's one of the best support mythics in the game. And if I had it originally in A tier, chat originally said, okay, we agree. Then we kind of thought about it, saw where all the other mythics were, and thought, this really is a staple, even if it is more niche in the support role. It is still a staple of that type of content, so we moved it up, gave it a bit of a promotion. Now we are in the A tier for the first time, and we start with Ring of the Pale Order. Now, Ring of the Pale Order originally, a spoiler, was in S tier, but chat kind of talked our way down. Some of them even wanted to put it as far down as the B tier, but what is Ring of the Pale Order good for? Well, restore 20% of the damage you deal as health. However, this value is decreased by 4% per ally you are grouped with. You cannot be healed by anyone but yourself, your pets, or your companions. Interestingly, it seems as though companions are coded to decrease its effectiveness by 4%. Well, let's talk about why this is no longer S tier, because let's face it, this was probably one of the most common mythics to use to run arenas. Baitstrand, it was very popular even in Infinite Archive, Maelstrom Arena. So what happened? Well, scribing has allowed people to essentially now put create a spammable with a heal. And also, people are utilizing a lot of classes like Templars, one in bar, one button, two button builds to run these arenas anyway. So, Ring of the Pale Order went from kind of a essential if you want to be able to get through these arenas very easily to a it's good, it's great, fantastic even, but it's no longer a staple of those arena builds because now you can kind of rely on scribing abilities or just use a very specific class and build to go with it. Next up is Crypt Cannon, which is also rated as excellent. Now, originally people had this all over the place, S tier, B tier. Crypt Cannon, you no longer cast ultimate abilities. Very weird, I know. Instead, casting an ultimate ability transfers your ultimate resource to living group members divided equally amongst them, and then you have minor heroism at all times. This is a super fantastic staple of ball groups. However, not all ball groups really run this anymore because they can get minor heroism from other places. So that's kind of how we talked our way down from the S tier. And originally we were in the B tier because we were kind of like, pretty much all sorts of resources and things are just naturally good in ball groups because they're very coordinated. So it's a bit hard to place, but Crypt Cannon easily falls in the A tier, but you could definitely argue higher or lower as well, because it's very niche in its utilization, but I don't know if you've ever been ulted like twice in a row, but it's not a fun experience. Next up, we have the Fawn Lark's Cladding. If you continuously sprint for 1 second, you gain the ability to pass through enemies. Enemies you pass through become charmed for 10 seconds, removing their ability to attack or cast as they move towards you. Charming an enemy this way restores stamina, magicka, and heals you. Charming an enemy removes you from stealth. This is a very cattywampus mythic, but a lot of you guys made a case that this is the second best way to build a farming setup because essentially you can sprint through the things that are keeping you from picking up a item off the ground and they're stunned. Some of you made the case that you could use this for PvP. I don't know how believable that is. I think really your best way to use this is for some sort of overland farming build, stage 4 vampirism, sprinting through and doing a whole bunch of gobbledygook. Even great if you're trying to do questing content, because a lot of times when you do quests, there's like a big boss like right before the door, but the door's not locked, so you could just run right past them, stun them, and then just go out into the next room. So from that aspect, sure, it's an A tier mythic. I don't know if I would put this here. You can blame this on the chat and not me. Next one, spoiler, also divisive because it is the Snow Treader's Boots. Now, the Snow Treader's Boots have been out for a long, long time. While you're in combat, you're immune to snares and immobilizations that can be cleansed, but you cannot sprint. So this is a very unique mythic, but it is also one that a lot of people love for PvP. A lot of people stand by it, but what's its best utilization for PvP? Well, probably group play on a support role. So support roles that are very mobile, but also if they're knocked down or interrupted or have any sorts of problems that could deeply impact the health and well-being of the group that they're keeping alive. So a lot of people use this on PvP support roles, and I think it is probably a fantastic mythic to run. It is very narrow in scope on what it's fantastic at. I think if you put this on a normal PvP build, it's probably closer good to great tier, which would put it closer to the B to C tier. But people did make the case, and they successfully swayed the chat, that if you use it for PvP support, it is an A tier mythic. Next up is Thracian Stranglers. Now, this one is also very hard to rate, because killing an enemy gives you a stack of Slode's Call for up to 1 hour, up to a maximum of 50 stacks. Each stack increases your weapon and spell damage by 23, but reduces your maximum health by 120 and reduces the effectiveness of your damage shield by 1%. Slode's Call is lost if you remove it, go invisible, or crouch. So what's difficult about this is, for example, this is probably one of the number one ways to score push or kill things the fastest way possible in the game. So you might think, okay, well, it's a staple. Well, we kind of were like, is it really a staple? Because most groups are not running Thracian Stranglers when they're trying to effectively farm something. It's a very high risk, high reward mythic if you want to run all 50 stacks at once, because your health is going to be severely diminished, damage shields are going to be severely diminished, but your damage output will be absolutely crazy. It's so hard to like put this on a scale of like 10, 9, 8, so settled on A tier. I do think that's probably a fair rating for the Thracian Stranglers. Next up is Spalder of Ruin. Activating Crouch activates and deactivates a 12-meter Aura of Pride. Up to 6 group members in that aura gain 260 weapon and spell damage, but it reduces your health, magic, and stamina recovery by 70 for each benefiting from your Aura of Pride. Now, if we put this in the A tier, there was a lot of claims for S tier. There was also a lot of claims for B tier. This is, talk about the positives, it's an unnamed buff. 260 weapon and spell damage, unnamed, fantastic. It means that you can stack that with all the other buffs in the game, named or otherwise. However, 6 group members, not the most fantastical, and it also reduces your magic S, stamina, and health recovery. And also, too, we live in a day and age where we have this new grimoire, the banner wearer. And I think a lot of people are looking to see if this is something that kind of will go down further on the tier list. Now, I don't think that necessarily will. I still think this is a fantastic mythic. I think it's very fair that if somebody said, describe Spalders of Ruin to me in a single word, I think fantastic is fair. So I do think A tier is fair over the S tier. But if you disagree, put it in the comments below. And to wrap up the A tier, we have Velrothi's Mage's Amulet. So it gives you 650 offensive penetration, increases your damage done to monsters by 15%, gain minor force at all time, which increases your crit damage done by 10%, but it reduces your light and heavy attack damage by 99%. Now, 99% is actually quite a lot. So where exactly is this mythic good? Well, it's fantastic on mostly Arcanists. Arcanists absolutely love this bad boy. Minor Force is a pretty decent one to have, but here let's talk about some drawbacks. Some drawbacks, notably immediately, are the fact that you can get Minor Force from other places, and yes, 15% damage done to monsters is great, as well as some offensive penetration, but also being able to light and heavy attack is also pretty good as well. So it's very narrow in scope on the type of PvE content and users of this mythic, which is why it's not a staple, even though arguably it is one of the best mythics in the game when it's built correctly. But to me, it's hard to argue it to go higher. I definitely think that there is an argument for it to be lower, but right now I think it sits pretty well, nicely in the A tier. It's still a fantastic mythic if you use it correctly for its notable types of content. Next, we are in the B tier. So these are all mythics that at their best, you could build them in some great builds. They're not going to be fantastic builds, more than likely. They would be just some great builds. And we start off with Left-Hander's Aegis Belt. Roll dodging no longer evades and instead grants a damage shield that absorbs 20,990 damage over 1 second, and that's not affected by battle spirits. That's 20,990 damage that you get a damage shield for 1 second. There's definitely some really specific builds. We actually looked up some on stream that really make great utilization of this mythic. And that's the word right there. Great. That's what the B tier is about. That's what this mythic does. This is obviously more of a PvP mythic focused build. You could use this for PvE content, but unless every time you wanted to block damage, you had to roll dodge, you're probably just going to make your life very difficult for yourself. And there's so many better mythics that you could choose. But Left-Hander Aegis Belt, comfortably in the B tier. Great mythic if you build it very particularly. Next up is Gaze of Sithis, which notably a lot of people say is basically just the introductory to PvP mythic. You get a bunch of health recovery, and armor, but you can't block. It's almost like the Oaken Soul Ring, where it's like, okay, here's like an introductory way to get into some content, but here's a pretty big restriction, except not being able to block is a big restriction as well, but the bonuses are definitely not near as good as the Oaken Soul. However, it is still a great way to build yourself into a kind of, it's essentially an instantly tanky build. You essentially have health recovery, and armor off the bat. Then you can slap on the rest of your sets being either sustain or DPS sets inside of PvP. So from there, you could find yourself a really easy, cheap PvP build. But still introductory, I would say definitely on the great end. A lot of people in chat agreed. Some people argued a little bit higher, but there are people that also argued a little bit lower just because health recovery is affected by Battle Spirit, which is important to note as well. But those are the kind of the conversations that occurred. And we finish off the B tier with the Marken Ring. Now, this gains 100 weapon and spell damage and 1157 armor for every set you are wearing with 3 pieces or more. So this is a good mythic in my opinion as well. Now, arguably, its best utilization, it is still great. But a lot of people were divided on this mythic because 100 named weapon and spell damage and 1157 armor is great. But also, you can't wear an infinite amount of 3-piece or more sets. For example, if you have two 5-piece sets, you're only getting 200 weapon and spell damage and then 2,200-ish armor. And that's good, but that's not great. So you have to use kind of some lesser known 3-piece sets to kind of get full benefit of this. So the best builds that you can get are arguably great with it, but they're arguably not fantastic or excellent. And to be fair, there's just so many other good, fantastic PvP mythics out there, especially. So that's why this one has sunk so low, even though it is very popular. But just because it's popular doesn't mean that it goes well with the sets. But this is a mythic too that as more 3-piece sets are created, it will only go up in value. It's kind of like when a new card comes out for a card game that doesn't have a lot of the combo pieces that it needs to be as good as it will be. Marking Ring, I definitely think will go up in the future. Next up, we have Malakith's Band of Brutality. It's our first C-tier mythic, which means that it's good. Increase your damage done by 16%. Yeah, that's good. But decreases your crit damage done by 50%. And honestly, this really should be a PvP mythic. And unfortunately, right now, a lot of people are building into wanting to do crit damage. Whether it's doing it with sets like a Mechanical Accruity or otherwise, you generally want to deal some crit damage. 16% damage done can still be used in some good builds. But would you be able to build this in a great build? Maybe, but it would be very difficult. That's why chat and I mostly put it as the first ones in the C tier. That doesn't mean it's bad. It just means that it's good and it's best utilization. Next up in the C tier, we have the Torque of Tonal. Now, this one is interesting because it's the lesser Torque, not Torque of the Alien King. This one, while your stamina is less than 50%, increase your Magicka recovery by 450. While your Magicka is less than 50%, increase your stamina recovery by 450. Now, I want to point out something to you, because I don't know if this is explicitly obvious. 450 Magicka and stamina recovery is not a lot. What that means is that 450 Magicka and stamina recovery is essentially just 225 Magicka and stamina recovery a second, and you have to be meeting some convoluted criteria of being less than 50% of stamina for your Magicka and less than 50% Magicka for your stamina. So there's just so many weird things about this mythic. Granted, resources are good, and you could stack this with other recoveries, but also if you feel the need to stack this with other recoveries, why would you waste your time using this mythic when you're already getting good recoveries from other sets like Wretched Vitality? To save us a lot of back and forth on what we discussed about this mythic, it's good. Having recovery is fine, but also it's just so narrow in what it wants to do, and it's not one that you're going to really want to go out and, be plucking right away to build with builds for. Next one is the Esoteric mythic, which makes you sound very fancy when you say it out loud. Say esoteric out loud. You'll feel very fancy. While you're above 50% stamina, you reduce your direct damage taken by 50%, but you lose a 968 stamina whenever you take direct damage, up to once every 3rd second. So you can see, this is very finicky as a mythic. It's very narrow in scope because obviously you generally want your stamina, usually, and losing stamina is generally very bad. But it only works when you're above 50% stamina, so that is kind of a bit of a built-in kind of safety feature there where you're not going to lose all your stamina. But this is such a weird mythic and very finicky for how to get it to use its best utilization. I would say, though, that if you slapped it with the right sets, us in chat agreed, you could still put this in a good build, especially probably for PvP, but man, would it be kind of convoluted. Next, we have the Storm Weavers. Now, Storm Weaver is really funny because it adds 300 Magicka recovery, and Sprint, Roll Dodge, Bash, Break Free, Sneak, and Block now consume Magicka instead of stamina. You reduce your Magicka recovery to 0 while blocking, sneaking, or sprinting, and you no longer reduce your stamina recovery to 0 while blocking, sneaking, or sprinting, etc. So, this is really funny because we were theory crafting on how you could use this set very effectively. And we noticed this set combination. So this is Prisoner's Rags, which comes from Cold Harbor. Reduce the cost of sprint by 50%. And while sprinting, you restore 1035 Magicka every second. Now, to put that in context, that is the equivalent of 2,070 magicka recovery while sprinting, which in theory should be about endless because this is actually not increasing your magicka recovery. This is just increasing your magicka, which is an important wording distinction, meaning that you should actually be able to effectively sprint forever. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, Jake, what in the Sam hell am I going to do with infinite sprint? I don't know, all right? I just come up with these good ideas that could potentially raise these things from the D tier to the C tier. So that's how we went from D to C. I think you could find some good utilization for that. It is, again, finicky, but it's fun to theory craft with some of these upcoming mythics. And unfortunately, we are now to the D tier. Now, well, notably, there's nothing in the F tier. So these are mythics that are about the average utilization. If you slapped on an Overland set, you probably would get about the same bonuses, and that would be a random non-DLC Overland set, unfortunately. Maybe a little bit better because we are above average, not average, but still. Shapeshifter's Chain. Reduce the cost of your Transformation Ultimate and Werewolf abilities by 15%. While transformed, you increase your max health, stamina, magicka by 1707. This mythic was buffed, for those of you who don't know. It did not used to give you a werewolf ability cost decrease by 15%. That was pretty big for it. But it's still, it's just not even good really for werewolves, you know? Like, you're losing out on great monster sets. You're losing out on using the Oaken Soul Ring, which, if you're going to make a 1-bar build, a werewolf is the best one to do it. You will be teabagged, unfortunately, when you're inside of Cyrodiil, but you know, those are the risks that you have to take when you're a werewolf. And unfortunately, you're probably not going to want to use the Shapeshifter's Chain. Next up is a mythic that I notably, last time we did this tier list, said was the worst mythic in the game. But some people have told me that it's not the worst. While sprinting, you gain a stack of Draconic Scales for every half second, granting you 660 armor up to a 20 stack. Upon stopping, you deal physical damage per stack in an 8-meter shockwave, and then you gain a damage shield equal to the damage dealt, and you retain Draconic Scales for 10 seconds. This is just a very finicky mythic. Also, too, at 20 stacks, this damage will also stun. So if you sprint around your enemies like the Flash for enough time, you can stun them. Now, again, we are above average, right? So you could build this in a way that I would say is above average. That, you know, it's better than the average 5-piece set or 2-piece or, you know, monster set. But it's just so weird, you know? Like, how often do you find yourself in a situation where you're the Flash and you're like, well, I just got to get charged up here, and you're sprinting around the enemies around them, and then you're like, well, hang on, I got to get 20 stacks here so I can stun you. Then you hit with the whoop-pow, and then they're stunned, and your bonus for that is a damage shield, some armor, and then a bit of physical damage and a stun. Probably a lot of easier ways that you could have accomplished those things. Next up, we have Savara's Bane's Ward. You cannot move while bracing. While bracing, you create a 12-meter zone of protection. Group members, notably group members, within the zone increase the amount of damage they can block by 30% and increase their health recovery by 950. Health recovery cannot affect yourself. So, this is just a lot going on here. One, you have 12 meters, so that's decent size, but it has to be group members. So you're thinking, okay, not ideal, because if you're in Cyrodiil, you want to be able to help other people as well. Also, too, they also had to really be blocking to get any sort of benefit from this, because if 950 health recovery in Cyrodiil is really not that great, because it's going to be battle spirited, so that's not going to be super fantastic for you. And yes, being able to increase the amount of damage they can block by 30% is neat, but you have to also be actively blocking when that happens. It's not like they just get that passively for being close to you. So this mythic, I think, doesn't do enough to be helpful majority of the time. Therefore, it's just above average. It's arguably even closer to average. Next up is a mythic that I so desperately wanted to be good. It's Beelzar's Band, and increases your damage done by light attacks by 900, so that's probably its best bonus. And then when you deal damage with consecutive melee light attacks, you gain a stack of Beelzar's Templar for 10 seconds. At 5 stacks, at a maximum of 5 stacks, you consume, and after 1 second, you deal 1471 physical damage to enemies in a line and stun them for 3 seconds. What essentially happens is the Minotaur just shoots out and deals some physical damage and stuns people. It looks great, but this is very convoluted for an easy to dodge stun, very little damage, and I'm just, I don't know what you would use this for. If you could find a utilization for this, I think light and heavy attack builds, maybe. If you don't have the Oaken Soul Ring, increasing your damage by your light attacks by 900 is certainly neat. But man, is this very cattywampus. And re-round off with Bloodlord's Embrace, which some of you wanted to put all the way in the F tier. Now, Bloodlord's Embrace is probably not quite that bad. Dealing damage with a bash attack grants a persistent, uncleansable blood curse on an enemy. You can only have one blood curse on an enemy at a time, and dealing additional bash damage removes that blood curse to a different enemy. When you block a blood cursed enemy, you restore 1605 magicka to you. This can occur once every second. So basically, you can get back a bunch of magicka. Now, a lot of people in chat noted that this is just not used for most types of content. And that there are niche situations where you would use this, but that doesn't necessarily justify it being higher. There are niche situations where a lot of people use a ton of above average sets that are not necessarily good or great, just because they may help in one specific situation. And I tend to agree with that line of thinking, in that we shouldn't just push a mythic to the great tier just because it might be decent at doing one specific thing. Because even if we're using the words like decent at, very specific trials, dungeons, or types of situations, I don't think that we should put it higher than where it is. And that's all the way down in the D tier. I know it feels a little bit harsh, but go back and blame the Twitch and the YouTube chat. I'm not a tank. I don't own this mythic. To me, though, I agree with their line of thinking, though, that there are some weird situations where we use weird sets that don't necessarily make them good or great just because we've used them decently in one situation. It just shows that they are above average in some types of content, and that's where we're going to throw the Bloodlord's Embrace. But everyone, thank you guys so much again for watching. This has been our Mythic tier list. Thank you to everybody on Twitch and YouTube that helped make this. And again, if they disagree on YouTube, you should have been there because you could have convinced everybody, because a lot of these came down to polls of, is it this, or should it be 9, 10, 8, 7? So a lot of these were determined by the actual, polls. But importantly, the conversation, I think, was the most important aspect of this actual dialogue. And that's what I think made this so fun to do. So thank you guys for all being involved in that process. And we'll be streaming again tomorrow. So if you have different things that you might want to do, tier list, ideas, and different things, let me know. And I will be sure to do that in tomorrow's live stream. We can always do something a little bit more broad as well. So thank you guys again. As always, we're doing our 3 giveaway drawing. All you need to do to enter is leave a comment in the comments below. Second thing is just make sure you're subscribed. And the third thing is look for a hidden word to be flashed upon the screen. If you're the first person to find and comment that word, you will win. Thank you guys so much again for watching. I'll catch you guys tomorrow. Sorry for the late video. It took a long time to put all this stuff down because there's so many mythics in the game. So thank you guys for sticking around to the end, and I'll catch you later. Bye, guys.
You better remember to like and subscribe to Jakeclips. Or you should. I might have to pluck your eyes if you don't. Or, better yet, I'll skip rope with your entrails. Do it now. Subscribe. Ta-ta. Off with you.